Hi, Paul. How are you?
Jamie, nice to see you. How are you doing?
Very good, thanks. Very good. Doing well. Thank you so much for making the time for this conversation. We've had a few sort of online text chats, so this is about as close as we'll get to in real life at the moment. So
We are sadly not IRL, but we are here live, and I have enjoyed following you on Twitter. I've enjoyed listening to past episodes, and I know you are my fellow Sent, so I welcome being on the show. It's a great honor for me.
brilliant. AJ Jacobs will be very proud that his term is finally taking off. I think this could lock in the viral adoption of the term sent.
Surely me using it will lead to virality here. No, AJ has actually had quite an influence on my life. I believe I'm one of the only people, that's not true, he has a ton of readers, but I believe I'm part of the rarefied group of people who has read every single one of his books. I'm a huge fan of his, and he's such a nice guy. When I was getting ready to release the book Clean Meat, I messaged him from his website, and I was nobody. I just heard him interviewed on something,
Yeah.
and I loved his writing. I thought he was a really funny and witty guy. And I asked him, would you consider writing a blurb for this book? And he didn't know me from Adam. He didn't know anything. And he responded to me like that night, be like, "Oh yeah, sure, I'm happy to do it." And I was like, "Wow, what a nice guy." He's just a really classy dude.
He is a genuinely lovely guy, and I thought it might be a bit contrived to sort of imply that his work resonates with the themes of sentientism, but it does, right? Everything he's done is about experimenting on himself to really try and understand the world and to help people extend their compassion. So this series of conversations, which I'm calling Sentientist Conversations, is really about the two most fundamental philosophical questions in my mind. What's real? How do we understand reality? And what matters morally? What should we care about? Or what should we have compassion for? And as you know, this idea of sentientism, some people see it as an upgrade or an extension of secular humanism, in that it says when we're thinking about what's real, we should use evidence and reason to form provisional or probabilistic beliefs. Always open-minded and always open to new evidence. And when it comes to what matters, the clue is in the name. We should have compassion for all sentient beings, any being that's capable of experiencing suffering or flourishing. So, the idea is it's a very simple, pluralistic philosophy. And these conversations really center on those two questions. But some of the people I talk to, agree with sentientism and how it answers those questions, and some don't. So it'll be fascinating to see how you answer those questions yourself. But before we get into that, it'd be great to just have a quick intro to your life and focus, so for the people that don't already know about your work.
Yeah, sure, Jamie. Well, I've been an advocate of sentientism long before I had ever heard the term sentientism. I have always loved animals since I was a child, and I've always had a feeling that what we do to them is really like bullying. That we treat them the way that we do, not because of any rational reason, but only because we are stronger than they are, because we can treat them in absolutely horrific ways with very little repercussions for us much of the time. So when I was a young teenager, when I was 13, that led me to become a vegetarian. And I had never heard, this is like back in 1993, I'd never heard of a vegan before, but I started reading literature that I was getting like in the snail mail. There was no like websites or anything back then, but I was getting snail mail, and I was reading about these people who I thought were called vegans. And, they were like not going to eat any animal products. And I thought, it seemed like a kind of admirable thing to do, but it almost seemed like holding your breath to me. Like, you can hold your breath for a while, but if you do it for too long, you'll die. And that's what I thought about not eating any animal products. I thought, well, maybe it can go a week or a month. I don't know, but you probably die if you do it too long. And then I read about, I don't know if you remember, Jamie, you probably do. Do you remember Carl Lewis? He was like this amazing Olympian. He was like kind of like the Usain Bolt of my childhood. He was like the best, runner, long jumper, and so on. But anyway, I really idolized him. And then I read this interview with him in which he said that his best Olympic years were when he was vegan. And I was like, wow. If Carl Lewis, who's like, not just getting by, but he's like, my idol, like one of the best athletes of the era, was vegan, that was pretty amazing. So I was like, wow. So I started volunteering in animal protection organizations as a young teenager. I met people who I learned were not vegans, but were vegans. And many of them have been doing it for a long time. And
although vegan has got a nice Star Trek ring to it, I think.
Yeah, no, I love it. It's in Carl Sagan's novel and in the book, Vega is where the extraterrestrial radio waves are coming from the Vega system. So I kind of like the idea that maybe we are from Vega. But point is that, I became vegan in 93, and basically my life has been devoted to trying to end the war that humanity is waging against the rest of the planet. So I founded in high school an animal protection club called Compassion Over Killing, and then turned that into a national organization and ran it for a number of years. And then was at the Humane Society for about a decade and a half, waging campaigns to pass laws to protect animals on factory farms. And I wrote this book called Clean Meat, which really explores the idea that probably the thing that is going to do the most to create a more sustainable food system is not humane sentiment. It isn't food sustainability concern, but it's just food technology that's going to make doing the right thing the easier, the more convenient, and the more cost-effective thing. And going back to A.J. Jacobs, I actually believe something he told me. I don't think that he's the one who invented this term, but he is the one who told it to me. So in my mind, he invented it. There's a saying that it's easier to act our way into a new way of thinking than to think our way into a new way of acting. In other words, in this particular example, when technology frees us from our dependence on an ethically abhorrent practice, it becomes a lot easier to question the ethics of what we were doing. So in other words, like you look back and you wonder, well, why was it that the northern states were able to legislatively end slavery in America, whereas the southern states were willing to go to war over it? And the short answer is because they were more economically dependent on it. It was a lot easier in the North, which had industrialized and wasn't dependent on an agrarian system of slavery anymore. It was a lot easier for them to view slavery as ethically abhorrent because they weren't economically dependent on it. The same is so with, let's say, if you think about whaling, how, we used to light our homes with whale oil. Then once kerosene was invented, it was a lot easier for us to start caring about whales because we weren't dependent on their exploitation. And the number of examples goes on and on and on. But I've basically come to the belief that we really have to make the unethical practices somehow obsolete, and then we can change our ethical calculations about them. For the most part, of course, there'll be some pioneers who stand against the grain, but for the most part, most humans don't do that. So that's why I wrote the book Clean Meat. And that's why I co-founded a company a few years ago called The Better Meat Co. And we can talk about it, but it's an alternative protein company trying to revolutionize the way that we feed humanity protein.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Fascinating range of contributions already. And I interviewed Vicky Bond from Humane League UK recently as well. So so it's good to stay in touch with what the Humane League are working on.
Great.
So that's a fascinating overview. It'd be interesting to wind the clock back, and you've hinted at some aspects of your journey already, but almost to jump away from the morality for a moment and go more to the epistemological side of your philosophy, because sentientism is interesting in that it's trying to link a sort of naturalistic understanding of the world with a moral philosophy, which some people don't like the idea of and others find it intuitive and grounding. If you go back into your childhood, how did you grow up in those sort of epistemological terms? Did you grow up in a religious household or a naturalistic atheist household? Has your view on those sorts of topics about what's real changed and evolved over time? Or
to some extent, I grew up in a Jewish household, and I was, sent to Hebrew school, bar mitzvah, confirmation. And so, I definitely grew up as a Jew, and I still self-identify as a Jew. But one of the nice things about being Jewish is that even if you question the existence of the supernatural, they don't kick you out. So it's pretty nice. It's very convenient. Point is that I grew up in a household that definitely had a lot of respect for animals. So my mom was on the board of directors of our local animal shelter, and we always had rescue dogs, usually 3 or 4 dogs at a time. And these animals to me were like my brethren, like I really loved them. I considered them like my siblings as opposed to pieces of property. Exactly. I mean, they slept in bed with me. These were like consider them more like my siblings than pieces of property. So I grew up with a deep love for dogs, which I still have. And my wife and I have an amazing dog who we love, who is definitely part of our family, takes up a lot of our time and other resources.
Yeah, with his own Instagram account as well, as I understand it.
You understand it correctly, Jamie. Anybody can go visit him. He's Eddie the Pity. That's EDDIE, the Pity. Eddie the Pity on Instagram. But point is that, my compassion really was for all animals, but it was in practice. It was just for dogs. Yeah. And it wasn't until I remember I was in 5th grade and some friends of mine asked me if I wanted to go down to this lake and play frog baseball with them. And, I started thinking about what it would be like from the frog's perspective, to be picked up by this giant who's hundreds of times bigger than you and cast through the air and then have all the bones in your body broken. Like I thought about it from the frog's perspective, and I just thought, this is insane. Like, how could we ever, why would we do this? These frogs are living their own life. They're just down there doing their thing. And we're going to just for fun, go torment them and kill them. And so I asked them not to do it, and they refused to cease. And so I went and told an adult and got them in trouble, and it sadly ended my friendship with some of them. But it was the first time in my life where I had ever really done something that I would say was against my own interests for animals, maybe.
Yeah. And how old were you at that point?
I was in 5th grade, so I don't know how old that is, maybe 10 or so. That led to a lifetime of advocacy for animals. It led me a few years later to become a vegetarian, as I mentioned, and then one thing led to another. And so I just, I've just thought, regardless of what you believe, if you believe that, there is a God, you believe there isn't a God, what we do to animals is so atrocious, and it's totally depraved. And, whether you're a secular ethical humanist or whether you're a devout, pious, religious person, anybody should be able to agree that, torturing animals for our own entertainment or for other trivial purposes is certainly something that is not a good thing to do. And much of what we do to animals, it falls into that category.
Yeah. And that's very early to take that sort of stand. And partly, maybe not intellectually, because I think that sort of empathy is something that many young humans are able to do, either through relationships with companion animals or just generally that they do at least have some basic reservoir of empathy that can span some species boundaries. So maybe it's not an intellectual thing to do, but it's socially a very unusual thing to do at that age, because as you said, you are risking personal friendships, you're risking being seen as weird, you're risking being seen as difficult, you're pushing against those social norms at a very young age, which is unusual. And that's also one of the very difficult things in a lifestyle consumption and a dietary journey for many people as well. As you went vegetarian at 13 and vegan later on, again, was that something that you found reasonably easy in your family context or your social context, or was it a bit more of a battle? How did the people around you that you loved and cared about think about the journey you were going on?
It wasn't that easy at the time. I mean, this is back in 93. People didn't know what the word was. They didn't know how to pronounce it. If anything, you tell them you're vegan, they thought you were from Las Vegas. It was there's not a lot of recognition about it. And my parents are very concerned, and it all happened very rapidly. But the time between when I went vegetarian and vegan was a matter of weeks. And so my parents are very concerned for my health. They just randomly picked a nutritionist who happened to be near us geographically, and we went to see her. And by the sheerest of coincidences, she was vegan herself. It was totally unbelievable. Yeah, it was
in 93.
So anyway, that was quite a shock. And one thing led to another. And actually, after that, my brother then became vegan, and my parents, I would say, are bivalvarians now. So they basically are vegan with the exception of eating some oysters and clams and mussels. They're very quick to point out that Peter Singer gives them the green light in animal liberation. They're like, no, Peter Singer says. Anyway, point is, they're pretty much there as well now, now 27 years later. But for a long time, they've been doing it. And my parents are great animal advocates. And so, I'm very proud of them.
Yeah, that's a great story. And one of the things that you mentioned is that your ethical journey there was somewhat independent of your religious community or your religious beliefs, your supernatural beliefs. And I think that's true of many people, whether they're religious or not. And it's one of the reasons why some people are nervous about moving away from a religious worldview, because they're worried that their morality will sort of lose its foundation. And that's certainly something you don't identify with as well. I mean, is it as simple as saying that your morality is founded in that sort of compassion for the suffering of others regardless of species. And is it that simple, or is
I do think that's a foundation of it, but I will say, I mean, I remember getting literally kicked out of Hebrew school. They called my mom and had her come pick me up because I was asking these questions about the slaughter of animals and why God would command it. Like we were learning all these sacrifices that he wanted and everything. I was like, why would he possibly want that? And I was really aggressive. I was like this sanctimonious 13-year-old. I had like the fervor. It's like even for religious people, there's like the fervor of the new convert. Like new converts are usually way more zealous than people who are raised in it. And so I was like that as a new vegan, and as a 13-year-old, I'm sure I was completely insufferable. But yeah, I got kicked out of Hebrew school one day for that. So it not only wasn't grounded in the religion that for me at that point, but it was also, almost antithetical. But I've since come to learn since then that actually there's a very rich tradition of vegetarianism within Judaism.
Yes.
And that there's all types of biblical mandates in the Hebrew scriptures for treating animals compassionately. Obviously, the Garden of Eden was a herbivorous place for Adam and Eve. And the only country on earth so if you look at like per capita vegetarianism, India is obviously number 1 on the planet, but number 2 for per capita vegetarianism is Israel.
Yes.
So
yeah.
And so like, I since have come to really embrace the long tradition of vegetarianism and of animal compassion that's in the faith. But to answer your question directly about my own philosophical underpinnings, I mean, I self-identify as a utilitarian. I've been very influenced by Peter Singer's writings and my conversations with him. And I want to minimize suffering. I want to, maximize happiness on the planet. I do think that happiness is important. So I differ with some of my utilitarian friends on that who really discount happiness. But I really do think that if somebody tells a joke and other people laugh, that the world is a better place. I think there's like moral value to it. So I'm pro happiness. I'm anti-suffering. Basically, it comes down to that. Very controversial point of view, I know.
Well, it shouldn't be, but many people shockingly disagree with us, right?
Yeah. In practice, that is true. But I think if you were to, in principle, ask people that, they would identify with those views, but they would not consistently apply it to their behaviors, I don't think. But yeah, and I used to care a lot about these things. In fact, I even published an academic, like a philosophical article about moral agency back in 2006, in which I argued that I believe that we discount the mental lives of other animals when we say that they aren't moral agents. Like we treat them as if they are moral patients as opposed to moral agents. And I really believe actually that other animals actually do have levels of ethics. And I write about it in this article, but I've since come to think like, was it really a great use of my time to do that? I don't know. I'm not sure that one person changed their behavior as a result of doing that. So I've since focused on other activities, but it is of great interest to me. And those types of philosophical questions about the human relationship with the other animals on this planet.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And as you say, I think that grounding feels very common sense and almost tautological to, I think, you and me. If suffering is bad, flourishing is good, how could you possibly disagree? But, most of the 8 billion people on the planet, while they might agree with that sentiment, one often sees something else as being more important, whether that's a nation state or a populist leader or a god or a church or an institution that, is even more important than suffering and flourishing. And
or they may even want suffering for the people who they perceive as their enemies or their foes or their, rivals or whatever. I mean,
I agree. And that's the the related problem is that they set their moral circle or their moral shape, whatever shape it is, in a way that excludes, either denigrates others or sees the suffering of others as a positive, or just excludes them from the moral circle and removes them from consideration completely.
That's right. And I mean, I think a lot of politics today is driven by a desire just to defeat the other side,
even if it's at your own cost.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I'd rather see them lose, even if I'm cutting off my nose to spite my face,
I agree. And it's something I have to remind myself of as well, is that, one of the there's only 2 tenets to this sentientism idea, but one is universal compassion for all sentient beings. And that includes people you disagree with. And that can be difficult sometimes. But it's, that's the real challenge. It's easy to be compassionate for, people and beings you agree with and have affinity with, but having that ability to have compassion for even those you disagree with viscerally is even more important, partly because it's very difficult to communicate effectively with someone if you don't show that you care about them. But also, if you don't have compassion for them, you're not going to be listening to their point of view, and therefore you're not open to new evidence and new approaches that may even improve your understanding of the world. So
and also, I mean, sounds kind of crazy, but maybe they're not wrong. I mean, who knows?
yeah.
Like, we feel like so confident in our point of view. Well, they feel very confident in theirs. So there's a meditative technique that you can do where you start out thinking and wishing for compassion and loving kindness toward those who you are close to, or those who you really love, somebody who it's really easy, like the lowest hanging fruit, right? And like your kids or whatever. And then you go out and you start thinking about strangers, but then you start going out to people who you hate, right? And then you're like trying to wish them well. And you see how far you can go. Like, can you honestly, genuinely wish well upon the people who have wronged you, or whatever beef you have with them? And so I think it's pretty useful to do. And just to remember, there's it's kind of, I don't know if it's a poem or a set of precepts, but it's called the Paradoxical Commandments. And if you can Google them, in fact, it was on Mother Teresa's wall in Calcutta. But it's like, people will be irrational and selfish. You should still love them anyway. People are going to wrong you. You should still forgive them anyway. People will destroy what you've built. You should still build anyway. And I'm paraphrasing it, but you can go look it up and see the actual one. But that's the basic premise. It's very difficult to live that way, but I aspire to it. I don't always achieve it, but I aspire to live that way because I think it's the most ethical and the most admirable thing to do. It's not what we were selected for. If you think about how evolution selected us, I mean, it was basically to, try to fit in your tribe and enhance your status within your tribe and look to your tribe for inclusion. Evolution didn't select us for being rational. It didn't select us for seeing reality. It didn't select us for, seeing the truth. It selected us for a very specific thing that's very different from that. In fact, Robert Wright, in his book, Why Buddhism is True, writes very well about this topic. Like, we were not selected through millions of years of evolution to be rational. Like, that is not what led to the greatest success, genetically speaking. It's helpful to remember that and then try to transcend our evolution to the best that we can, try to actually aspire to be rational, even if it's not what helped our ancestors procreate more.
Yeah. And I think there's that sort of naturalistic, rational approach, of course, has evolutionary value, because if you're an entity in the environment, having a reasonably accurate representation of that environment is useful, right? If you can genuinely identify a tiger, it's useful. Whereas if you get that wrong, that can bring an end to you pretty quickly. As you say, that's not exactly the same as rationality and evidence being perfectly selected for, right? There are certain circumstances where survival and procreation and continuation of the pattern that we are, isn't quite perfectly correlated. So we're lucky enough to have sort of developed this kit that we can use to, transcend those evolutionary origins to a degree, at least refine them.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you an example. I know that this is not a political show, but there's a large group of people who enhance their own status within their group right now by believing in a complete fiction about election fraud and that the election was stolen from them and so on. There's no actual evidence for this. But if they were to say that, it would subtract from their status within their social group. And who's going to do that? Who's going to do something? There's no cost to them to believing the fiction. They get the righteous indignation, they get acceptance within their group. And so it's perverse incentives for people within that social circle to believe in something that is completely false, yet it is absolutely status enhancing for them in their own circle.
And I think, an optimistic reading would say that it's only advantageous for an individual to believe things that aren't true when they're part of a group that rewards that.
Yes.
But almost by definition, that group over time is less likely to do well because their perception of reality of the individuals within it is not correlated with reality. And reality can be a harsh teacher. Looking over history and even current developments, that process can take a long, frustrating while to run through. And maybe there's some naive optimism there. So.
I mean, maybe, but I mean, sometimes the people who believe in certain fictions actually do pretty well. Like if you look at two examples. I mean, one, look at who some of the world leaders are at this time. People who believe in certain types of fictions have actually succeeded politically. But even at the individual level, I mean, there's a lot of evidence that athletes who delude themselves into thinking that they are the best, they are the single fastest person on the planet, they are the best long jumper, the best swimmer. It's completely delusional to think out of 8 billion people, I'm the best one on the planet. But there is real evidence that shows that people who self-deceive and believe in that actually do better. They actually perform better in the real world, not just in their mind. Maybe self-delusion in that case is actually advantageous for them.
For people like me who have a sort of very naturalistic and quite hard sort of physicalist, materialist worldview, scientific, if you like, there's a danger of hubris in that as well that can sometimes come across a sort of preachiness and arrogance, a sort of overconfidence. We have the facts. This is the answer. And as soon as you've done that, you've lost the basis of what's important about a naturalistic or a scientific mindset, which is open-mindedness, always new evidence, never 100% confident. We're never accepting any dogma. But so we need the right level of humility.
I totally am with you. Humility, sadly, is not generally a hallmark of humanity. But one of my favorite quotes from Darwin, and I will paraphrase it since I don't have it in front of me, but he said, there's nothing that instills confidence as much as ignorance. Generally, knowledge leads you to be more humble because you realize that things that you thought were true aren't true. Things that you remember with absolute certainty turn out actually your memory was fallible. Or things that you believe so fervently one decade, the next decade, you no longer ascribe to that point of view. So,
or how much you just don't know.
Yeah. And that's also like, going back to this question about God and so on, like I really have absolutely no idea. Right. Like, I mean, I'm not saying, I think like human created religions are likely to be true. But what I am saying is that 95% of what's out there in the universe, dark matter, we still don't know anything about it whatsoever. Yeah. Now, I'm not suggesting that dark matter is like looking over us and like Santa Claus monitoring everything that we're doing and they're going to punish us, or reward us. I'm not talking about that. But the reality is like we don't understand even some of the most basic things about our universe, some of the most basic things. I mean, science itself is like a blink of an eye, historically speaking, just only hundreds of years old. I mean, it's like, truly incredible. And the actual scientific revolution that led to the Enlightenment and so on. So I think that we still have a lot to learn. We shouldn't be so confident in our points of view to say with absolute certainty that something may or may not be true. I think more likely, like the human cranium is very small, has a very little amount of matter inside of it. The universe is extremely vast, extremely vast. And I think there is some hubris in thinking that we can figure it out. So it's not only that I think maybe I don't know, it's more like thinking I can't know. But my life is led in such a way by principle. I try to lead my life in such a way that I'm going by ethical principles that are rooted more in a naturalistic and rational point of view, because that to me seems like at the end of my life, the thing that I'll care the most about is whether the world is a better place or not, whether there was less suffering and more happiness on the planet because I had lived. I don't care if I have a funeral or a gravesite or anything, but I do hope that if anybody eulogizes me, the only thing I'll care about will be that the world was better because I had existed. And, each one of us is doing a lot of harm in the world all the time, right? Like we're polluting, we're creating trash, we're hurting people's feelings, we're running over animals in our cars, like all these things that we do that are creating a lot of harms. So for me, the question is, can I do more good than harm? Can I justify my existence by doing even more good than the harm I know that I'm causing every day of my life? And my hope is that while, of course, you can never eliminate the harm that we cause, we're always going to do things through unskilled behavior. I know I certainly have myself. Can we do more good? Can we actually outweigh the harm we're doing? And that's my goal in life, really.
And that's an inspiring vision, I think, partly because you're not pretending we can ever be perfect. I mean, it's impossible to live, an ethically perfect life. And you might not get that impression from some, more militant vegans who can sometimes come across as they've approached some sort of perfect ethical position that no one else can approach. But it just isn't the reality. But the fact that some perfection isn't attainable isn't a reason not to try and just do better. And you framed that beautifully. And that's really where I'd like to come on to the next section of the conversation is about the future. So we're in this somewhat odd position where I think this sort of naturalistic grounding for ethics and this broad moral circle that really says, look, any suffering matters, right? Any suffering being should be included as we work out what's the good thing to do. To me, and I think to you, feels somewhat self-evident and pretty straightforward. But most people on the planet disagree, as we've discussed, right? They either have different worldviews or exclude certain classes of being from their moral consideration. So the typical person might grant conceptual moral consideration to all of the human race, but might exclude some parts of the human race based on sex or gender or some other, we know how much work we've still got to do on that. And then we go across the species boundary, and most people will grant moral consideration to their companion animals and maybe some charismatic wild animals, but not to the other wild animals, and certainly not to farmed animals. Others would even go further and say, look, I grant moral consideration to ecosystems and habitats and species or Gaia, but most of those people also still exclude moral consideration for individual sentient beings that can actually suffer. So there's challenges there as well, right? And in a way, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could just persuade everybody to agree with us and click our fingers? And we just know that isn't the way the world works, and that isn't the way humans work. And we've touched on this challenge a number of times because those social norms hold us really hard. What we're taught almost from birth by parents and teachers and society at large and the media and priests and whoever else, that has an enormous shaping influence on the way we think and our ethics. There's an inertia around that stops us applying logic and our own thinking to break out of some of those traditions. And you're very unusual at the fact that sort of 10 years old, you were ready to crush through some of those social norms. So in that context, that sort of frustration where it feels like there's a latent agreement that we could get the rest of the human race to have with us, but we can't break through these social norms. How do you think about the future? And I guess what's the best way of getting more people to agree with us? Or failing that, what's the best way of getting more people to do more good? And you can use whatever timescale you like. You can think sort of super sci-fi or...
I'm eager to answer your question, but before I answer it, let me give a preface by saying why I think there is hope, right? Because look back, take like the question of slavery as an example. For most of human history that has been recorded, slavery was considered normal and natural, right?
Yeah.
It's in the Bible. God sanctions it. In the Bible, you've got the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, they all had slaves. That was considered a normal and natural thing for the majority of recorded human history. Did something change in our genome that led us to become more ethical? No. Did something change where someone just persuaded everybody else? Not really. It basically was a question eventually of outgrowing these type of agrarian systems and by having a lot of pressure to say, basically, this is something that is going to make us look down on you. People do things so that other people will look up to them, and they try to avoid doing things that will make other people look down on them. There's a good book called The Honor Code, which talks about this. I forget the guy's name, Kwame Appiah, I think. I don't remember. But anyway, maybe in the show notes, you can put that book. It's called The Honor Code. It's very good. And it basically talks about how, people don't want to do things that are going to make people look down on them. And that's how things like foot binding in China largely came to an end, and the same with slavery. But now go back like 150 years ago and think about the fact that in America, 150 years ago, the legitimate social debate being had was whether one person could hold another person in bondage. You could be on either side of that debate and be considered a respectable member of society, a doctor, a lawyer, a member of Congress, whatever. 100 years ago, the debate was whether more than half of us even ought to be able to vote, right? Like with this huge debates, should women be allowed to vote? 50 years ago, we were debating whether whites and blacks ought to be able to share the same drinking fountains. I mean, and then, you come forward to today and you realize, like, if you were to hold the wrong view on any of these, you thought slavery was good, you were against women's suffrage, you were for racial segregation, you would be a pariah, right? Like, just announcing that you held those views would probably get you fired from your job. It would probably lose your friends, might even make news. Like, if you were somebody who was a public person, and you announce that you held those views, you might make news just for holding it. Yet a blink of an eye ago, historically speaking, holding those views on the wrong side would have been a totally respected view to hold. Even if the wrong view, it wouldn't have led you to be ostracized and excommunicated from, your social circle, basically. And so what what views today that people are holding are going to, in the future, be viewed as morally abominable in the same way that we view denying more than half the population the right to vote, or holding millions of people in bondage, and so on. And I think pretty clearly what we do to animals will be seen with a very unkind eye. That when people look back and they recognize that we subjected literally billions of sentient beings to life in cages where they could not even extend their limbs, not for some noble purpose, but just so that, just to cut some corners economically. And people will wonder, how could anyone have ever defended it? But the reality is that most people don't even defend it. I mean, every time a state has voted on whether or not to ban an extreme confinement practice on factory farms, whether it's a red state like Arizona, a blue state like California, a swing state like Florida, they've overwhelmingly voted to ban these inhumane factory farming practices. Overwhelmingly, by double digits. Every single time it's been by double-digit votes. So it's clear that it's not that people want animals locked up in these cages, but people buy the cheaper products that are on the shelf typically. And, the reason why these animals are locked up in cages where they can barely move an inch their whole life is because it reduces cost. So, people act differently when they are acting as citizens than they do when they're acting as consumers. And I think it's important that we can codify the social norms that we have regarding animal protection into law, so that you can correct for that problem, because people don't actually want animals locked up in cages like this. In a democracy, when you have that overwhelming view, that really ought to be codified into law. Nearly everybody, the vast majority of people at least, think we should not be locking animals in tiny cages. We shouldn't be mutilating their bodies without pain relief, and so many of the other depravities that we inflict on animals. So I really am a big believer in just codifying into law and in corporate policy as well, that some of these social norms. So when I say corporate policy, I mean, fast food chains should set policies and said, if you're going to sell us eggs, these are the animal welfare standards you need to meet. And at a minimum, you can't lock the birds in tiny cages. So that is one reason why I'm hopeful, is because I see time and time again, voters deciding to ban these practices. I'm also hopeful, though more importantly, I would say than that, is because I really think that technology, if we can make it happen fast enough, can render the exploitative practices obsolete. If you look at the founding of the animal welfare movement in the United States, it largely was founded because the people were in the 1860s and 70s were outraged by the treatment of horses. They saw the horses being beaten in the streets and so on. And the animal welfare groups waged all these campaigns. They wanted resting days, like Sabbath days for the horses, so they couldn't be worked one day a week. They wanted resting hours for the horses. They wanted water stations for the horses. And then Henry Ford came along and rendered the exploitation of horses for our transportation and labor pretty much obsolete. And he didn't care about horses at all. But he did more for horses than the animal welfare campaigners even dreamt of doing. They weren't saying stop using horses. They were saying treat the horses better. Similarly, we used to, as I mentioned earlier, hunt whales for light, and then we didn't stop because we cared about whales. We stopped because we invented kerosene. We used to use carrier pigeons in ways that were quite detrimental to their interests. And then the telegraph was invented. We stopped using carrier pigeons.
Something faster, cheaper, and easier came along.
Exactly. So, think about, for thousands of years, the primary writing utensil was quill pens. And these are live plucked from geese. We ripped their feathers out. In fact, Thomas Jefferson wrote so prolifically that he had his own geese at Monticello, where he bred them so that he could have a constant supply of quills, where they're just live plucking these birds, because they only produce a very small number of quills. It's not any feather. It's only the wing feathers that they could use. And so you had these birds being live plucked for their quills. And nobody stopped doing this because they cared about the geese. They stopped because the metal pen was invented in the UK in the 1820s, and it made a much easier way, because metal pens were stronger. You didn't have to sharpen them. You didn't have to stop and dip them into an inkwell because they had the ink inside of the pen already. There are all these benefits to it. And so if you look at all of these things, and the list goes on and on, there's so many other things that are examples of this, but the list goes on and on, that if you look, nearly every time we have stopped an entire industry from doing something bad to animals, almost always it has been not because we were persuaded of some moral argument about why it was inhumane to do it. And so I'm a big believer that technologies like growing meat from animal cells, like plant-based meat, like hybridization, like microbial fermentation, and other similar technologies are going to create foods that are better, cheaper, and more convenient than the way that we produce meat and other animal proteins today. That, I think, is the real key to actually freeing ourselves from a dependency on factory farming of animals. And then once we're no longer dependent on it, we can then start adopting these ethical views where we start seeing animals as individuals who have interests that matter unto themselves, as opposed to merely viewing them as existing here for the sole purpose of serving us for whatever we want. If we want to get to a world where we view animals as existing here with us, as opposed to existing for us, we have to reduce our dependency on those animals first. And the fastest way to do that is by advancing technology that renders our current exploitative practices obsolete.
It's very hard to condemn a system that you know you're guilty as part of, right? But once you've, because of technical advancement or because of alternatives being fast, cheap, easy, environmentally less damaging, you've already moved onto that alternative. It frees you, as you say, to then condemn the system you used to be part of. But it's very hard to do while you're part of it, as well as the social pressures that we talked about before.
Oh, the cognitive dissonance is intense. I mean, I think about it myself. I consider myself an environmentalist. I consider myself very concerned about climate change, yet I still drive a car that consumes gasoline. And it's so easy for me to think, oh, well, I don't really drive that much. I excuse it, all these things, right? But, if electric cars were actually cheaper than internal combustion engine cars, of course, then many people would switch and they would think, oh, how could anybody drive a gas guzzling car? I do drive a hybrid at least, so it gets good miles. But still, the point is, as you said earlier very correctly, Jamie, none of us are perfect. All of us are trying to do the best that we can. And it's very hard to condemn yourself. And I think about that with so many things that I do, including flying for unnecessary purposes and other things that I know are making the climate situation worse, even though my own self-identity is somebody who's very concerned about climate.
Yeah. And I think that's one thing that can help us have compassion for the people that are in a different place on the journey, because you and I still have cognitive dissonance now. And, and I, for a lot longer than you did, had exactly the cognitive dissonance around animal product usage that, we're discussing now. And I remember who I was at that point. I wasn't a bad person, right? I wasn't an evil person. I considered myself quite a careful moral thinker, and I was just deliberately avoiding thinking about the topic because I didn't like the social implications of where it would take me, and so I just decided not to think about it. It was almost that simple. It's crazy, but and I think you're right. Is that on the one hand, it would feel so much more righteous just to win the moral argument. But I think we've won the moral argument, as you say. I mean, the Sentience Institute have done some fascinating surveys that echo what you've said, which is that around half of even people who consume meat think that factory farms should be banned, and there's even quite high percentages that think slaughterhouses of all sorts should be banned as well. So in a way, I think you're right. We've almost won the moral argument, but the system and the social norms mean the inertia and the momentum of that system continues. That's what we've got to do, is to bring in the alternatives. But
yeah, exactly. I mean, I think you're right, Jamie. Most people eat meat not because animals were tormented and slaughtered for it. They eat it in spite of that fact.
Yeah.
And, if we were rational, you would just have the following syllogism and it would solve everything, right? So start out with a premise everybody agrees with. Causing unnecessary suffering to animals is wrong. Everybody's going to agree with that. Eating meat is not necessary for most people. So then you're going to, or at least for most people listening to this podcast, let's say, is not necessary. Therefore, the conclusion is inescapable, right? Like, it's a very easy syllogism. It's very deductive. You just say causing unnecessary suffering to animals is wrong. Eating meat is not necessary for many people. Therefore, what's the conclusion? It's very obvious, but we're just not a rational species. That's all there is to it. If facts and figures were going to persuade us, this would have been solved a long time ago. Sadly, that is not what tends to persuade people. It's just unfortunate, but the human mind is not known for its reasonableness.
And there are too many predictions in this business already, but how optimistic are you about how quickly we can make companies like the Better Meat Co. and others? Mm-hmm. How quickly do you think we can make it happen? And I'm also interested, in the time we've got left, on how you see the role of business in being a force for good, hence your podcast. Because there are, Sentientism is somewhat, very broad political stance. It has implications, but it doesn't define a political stance. But we have some people who share our compassionate worldview, who think that business is just an evil force of capitalism grinding sentient beings into the ground to make dollars. And and people at the other end who are saying, actually we can retool capitalism and business to, embed ethics, and per your podcast, have business be a force for good that can drive it forward.
Yeah, if there's a faster way, I'm all ears. I'd love to hear what it is.
Yeah.
But for those who assert that, the only way is to end capitalism, I guess I would ask, well, how did we end slavery without ending capitalism? How did we get women's suffrage without ending capitalism? Like, there's lots of counterexamples. It doesn't really seem to be that you have to do that. But I am, to answer your first question, Jamie, I mean, my biggest concern is just how fast this all can happen, because the world is literally on fire. I live in Northern California, where the fires are all around us. Even today, we're recording this in December. And even now in December, we still have wildfires in California. It's unbelievable. And so my question is, species are going extinct at a very rapid rate. The world is on fire, quite literally. Can we actually do this fast enough? Because if you look at technologies like clean meat or cultivated meat, you're thinking really about, things that aren't going to make a dent for years to come. Even if they come on the market. Right. Even if they come on the market in the next year or two, they're not going to actually be making a dent. It's a problem that is vexing, because I don't believe that we have the luxury of time. But if you look at the transformation of other things, like look at the transformation of the film industry, right? I mean, this was, for decades we had print film, and then it seems like very quickly we went from print film to digital film, because it was so much better, just so much better. I mean, I remember when 1 hour Photoshops came out, I was so psyched. I couldn't believe we were going to get our photos in an hour. And now imagine if it took a minute. Imagine if it took a minute to get your photo. You'd be outraged, there'd be rioting over in the streets. Apple's stock would crash. I mean, it would be unbelievable. So I do think there are some examples where the transition has occurred very rapidly. In fact, even with kerosene and whaling, within 3 decades, the whaling industry in America, which was a huge economic force, collapsed by more than 90% after kerosene was patented. I do think there are some examples of it happening fast, but we're going to have to get a lot cheaper. Right now, plant-based meat is still sold at multiples over the cost of animal meat. It's, I don't mean like 30 or 40%. I mean like 300 or 400% more. You're just not going to become a mainstream product with those type of prices. So the price has got to come way down. Then I think you'll see a pretty rapid change once that occurs. Now, to answer your question, though, Jamie, about business, I mean, look, I don't believe there is a faster way. I don't believe that people are just going to have a change of heart and a change of mind and change their behavior. I think that we have to make it easy. The reasons that drive people's food choices are not the primary reasons that animal advocates argue for. When animal advocates will say, oh, here's why you should consider plant-based eating, they'll say, oh, well, it's better for animals, it's better for the planet, it's better for your health. All of that is true, but those are near the bottom of the list of things, of factors that people are considering when they are purchasing their food. When they're purchasing their food, the things that actually drive their choices are more like taste, price, and convenience. Not ethics, not environment, not health. It's taste, price, and convenience. For most food choices, that's what they're made on. So what other way are we going to get to people if we don't have these products that can compete on the things that actually drive consumer purchasing decisions? That's all there is to it. So I'm a big believer that businesses can create real value by helping to shift our protein industry away from one that's based on animals and one that instead is based on things like plants and microbes and so on. It's not just there. It's also, in my podcast, Business for Good, I profile companies that are making money by making the world a better place. And so, interestingly, for example, we had a recent episode with a company that's making transparent solar. So think about a skyscraper. There's only so much room on the roof of the building that you can put solar panels, but they have invented a way to make transparent film that collects solar energy that goes on the windows. So now you have every window on the side of the building that can be collecting solar energy.
You've doubled the surface area, or
well, way more than double. You've multiplied it by hundreds of times when you compare it to think about a skyscraper, right? Think about a building that is tens of stories tall. All of that side windows can be all of a sudden become solar harvesting devices. So that's a great example of how a business can really help to transform the energy usage of a major building with that type of a technology. Or if you think about another company that I profiled on there, where they have figured out a way to make coral in a controlled environment, make coral that grows 50 times faster than it does in nature, and then transplant that coral in the wild to coral reefs so that, and it replenishes the reef. The reef can flourish again because you can have these corals that are super fast growing and cause them to prevent the reef from dying. And there's a lot of economic activity associated with that. Think about every hotel and a tourist location. They want people come there and snorkeling and scuba diving and so on. They're paying this company to do this for them. So, without that profit motive, I'm not sure why they'd be doing it. And the same with the transparent solar and so on. So I really think that, yes, it's certainly true that businesses can be used to do bad things like pollute and harm animals and so on, but it can also be the solution to the problem. And these examples, like what I'm talking about here, seem to me like really good solutions to real problems that we're facing.
And there's long been a school of thought in corporate governance that almost says business should not be ethical and it should not have values built in. It should just be about shareholder, maximization of value, and therefore it's all about the stock price and the dividends and so on. But that's always seemed odd to me, and I think business is recognizing this now, because businesses are just another way for human beings to collaborate, and each one of those human beings does have ethics and values, right? Whether you're a shareholder or a leader or a manager or a CEO, like you're an employee or a customer. So why shouldn't those values be reflected in the way that business operates?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. There's there's an economist named Milton Friedman who basically propagated this idea that, the only purpose of a business is to maximize shareholder value. And I do think that increasingly businesses are recognizing that they have a much higher purpose than that. And, John Mackey talks about this. He's the founder and CEO of Whole Foods Market. And I had him on the Business for Good podcast. And he had a great analogy. He said, your body has to make red blood cells. If it doesn't make red blood cells, you'll die. But that doesn't mean the purpose of your body is to make red blood cells, right? The purpose of your body is to do whatever it is that you determine to be the purpose of it. And so the same way a business must make money, it doesn't mean it's the purpose of the business. So, the purpose of Whole Foods, he would argue, is to basically make people healthier, right? The purpose of Google was to assemble all the world's information and make it easily accessible to anybody for free. Conscious businesses have a purpose. The purpose of the Better Me my company, is to help reduce humanity's footprint on the planet by helping the protein industry use fewer animals and more plants and other types of non-animal proteins. That's the purpose of our company. Sure, if we don't make money, we go out of business, but that's not the purpose of what we are doing. The reason I co-founded this company and the reason I work here and spend so much of my life doing it is because I want to help solve this problem. So I would reject that claim that the purpose of a business is solely to make money. Sure, it has to make money. If it doesn't, you're done. But you set the purpose for your business if you are a part of that business. And that, to me, is what being a conscious business is all about.
Yeah, thank you. And to wrap up, I think, we share this sense of frustration that the pace of social change, and particularly critical changes like the ones we've been talking about, always feels too slow. But when you look historically, if you can make that ethical shift easy for people, and you can use technology and business as part of a force for good to make that better way of acting more normal, and the ethics can follow along. And I think when we look historically, it's amazing how quickly positive change can happen. And I hope that future generations will look back at the work that you're doing and say, isn't it amazing how quickly we managed to end animal farming and reduce our footprint on the planet? So.
Well, Jamie, I hope that I doubt that you and I will be alive at that point, and I just hope that people at that time, whatever problems they're facing, I hope they build upon what we did to do something even greater than what we're doing. My hope is to make a difference. My hope is to reduce the amount of suffering on the planet. If I can contribute to that, I'll be thrilled. And I hope that if it inspires somebody else to do something even greater, my hat will be off to them and I'll be applauding them from my grave.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for all you do. And thank you for coming on Sentientist Conversations today. And one of the things we're hoping to do here is, in a tiny way, is just to normalize this sort of compassionate, rational thinking and incentivize people to make the world a slightly better place in everything they do. But before we wrap up, what's the easiest way of people following your work and learning more about your mission and the things you do?
Oh, I welcome hearing from anybody. I'd love to hear from you. You can go to bettermeat.co, again, bettermeat.co, and get in touch with me there.
That's great. And I'll include links to your book and your TED Talks and your other work and your podcast, of course.
Very nice of you. I should be more promotional. Yes, Queen Meat is.
Yeah, I'm trying to help you.
Thank you, Jamie. Queen Meat, growing meat without animals will revolutionize dinner and the world. You can buy it anywhere, but go to cleanmeat.com and you can see all the places you can get it on Amazon and everywhere else.
All right, it's been a real pleasure talking to you, Paul. It's been an inspiration.
Jamie, I'm giving you a virtual fist bump from here in Sacramento, California, my friend.
Cheers, Sent. Thank you.
You got it, Sent.